Hey guys, it's Dave. Welcome back to another video. Hope you had a good Christmas and New Year's. I'm here today to talk about a recent video I saw online. It's from a podcast called the All In Pod. It's extremely famous. It's run by four big investors, venture capitalists, big business people, lots of money between them. And one in particular, probably the most famous of the group, at least as far as I'm aware, Chamath Palihapitiya. He made some comments about Rocket Lab and other space companies that really raised my eyebrows and I really had to disagree with. So I really wanted to make a little rebuttal video and just kind of give my side of the argument there because it was really dismissive of Rocket Lab and some other space companies. So I really just wanted to post my reaction and share my thoughts on what he said. So if you don't know who he is, he's obviously extremely wealthy. He's a billionaire. He's had massive returns in the stock markets over the past, 20 plus years. I believe the technical term for the amount of money he's made is a buttload. But he's been involved in a bunch of space companies, actually. So it's quite interesting because he was an investor in SpaceX and still is. He is an early investor in Relativity, which is another private rocket company that is a up-and-coming player in the industry. They haven't launched anything yet, though, so they're still very new, and they've raised absolutely massive amounts of money, tons of money for a company that's never launched a rocket before. A little eyebrow-raising. They are a very interesting company, though, so I do like to follow them, even though we can't invest in them ourselves because they are not on the public stock market. Anyway, as well as all that, he was very involved in the SPAC craze we went through for a few years there from 2020 to maybe 2021, late 2021, where a ton of companies went public via SPAC, and I believe he was involved in facilitating a bunch of those SPAC deals to bring companies public, including actually Virgin Galactic. So I do believe he made a ton of money off of Virgin Galactic's going public, and that company has also been a real dog ever since that date when they went public. Obviously, he's been very successful. He knows what he's talking about in a lot of respects, and I do respect him as a smart guy and an investor, but that doesn't mean I have to agree with everything he said. Actually, there's been many things he said on his podcast that have really rubbed me the wrong way, and I've disagreed with him on over the past year or two since he started running this podcast, and this is just one more. So I don't really follow him as much as I used to. I did make a video way back about how watching some of his interviews convinced me to invest in a company called Slack back in the day, and that also didn't turn out well for me. But anyway, just because he's successful doesn't mean he's right about everything, and this is one I really disagree with him on. So I just wanted to share my thoughts on it. Let's go ahead and watch the video together of what he said about Rocket Lab and Relativity Space.
Who do you have, Chamath, for your biggest business winner of 2023?
I'm going to pick something out of my portfolio.
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm the only non-trivially large investor in both SpaceX and Relativity Space. Relativity Space has a huge... SpaceX is clearly just crushing on all cylinders. And they're really the only game in town with respect to launch capability. And if you just Google it, you'll see that the Europeans, have a hit or miss capability on launch. The Russians are completely unable to do launch now because of all of these sanctions. The private companies in New Zealand or the United States have also had fits and starts, really incapable. Relativity, which is now the second most highly valued space business, is about to do a launch in the third week of January. And the big difference between it and SpaceX, which is sort of why we did it, this is a early YC company. I did the Series A and kind of went along the whole way. They have 3D printed everything. And the reason why 3D printing is interesting is so if you think a rocket costs $5 billion if built by NASA, Elon was able to take that to 100 to 500 million. And if you 3D print everything, you can take that cost to like 5 to 50 million. And so it allows you to just have this repeatability and manufacturability. Now, SpaceX also has a lot of 3D printed parts, but Relativity is entirely 3D printed. it has a launch in 3 weeks at Cape Canaveral, I think. And we have like a $10 billion order book that gets unlocked. So I don't know how to see beyond a lot of these market forecasts right now. So I'd rather pick a company. I'll pick something in my portfolio. If the rocket does not blow up, there's a $10 billion order book, and this company is now on a trajectory to be as valued as SpaceX.
All right.
So clearly when he's referring to private companies out of New Zealand, there's only one, and that is obviously Rocket Lab. And he's basically saying they're incapable of launch, which is something I really disagree with. Very dismissive of Rocket Lab and all the other companies out there working on launch, really. And I don't think Relativity is the only game in town. It is a very interesting company, but Rocket Lab has been launching for years. So I guess my first response to Chamath saying that Rocket Lab is incapable would be this really short clip.
Start, 2, 1, mission, and liftoff.
By the way, I just wanted to take a quick break to say if you're enjoying the video and if you like talking about investing with me, please do consider hitting subscribe down below. It will really help out the channel. We also have a link to a Discord server down in the description where we talk about different investing ideas, share our research, that kind of thing, and you are welcome to join. So I hope to see you there, and with that, let's get back to the video.
So yeah, I mean, clearly Rocket Lab has flown almost 30 missions now successfully on Electron. They've sent a mission to the moon for NASA. They're working on sending a mission to Venus and Mars. These are not trivial things by any means. They've really been the only ones thus far to consistently launch successfully as a private company in the small launch space. SpaceX did launch their Falcon 1 originally, which was a bit larger than the Electron, but they kind of scrapped that and moved on to the Falcon 9, a much larger vehicle. So I really wouldn't dismiss Rocket Lab that easily. I think they're a very successful company, and they've done a lot of really amazing things, and they're also working towards a larger launch vehicle themselves in the Neutron rocket. Now, that's not to say Relativity isn't interesting for their own reasons either. Relativity does have some interesting stuff going for it. So, as Chamath said, they 3D print the entire rocket, basically. And at least from my understanding, it's a little deceiving to say that just 3D printing everything reduces the costs that substantially. Some parts lend themselves to 3D printing much better than others. For example, Rocket Lab was actually the first one to ever 3D print their engines, and they do that, and it works extremely well for small parts and things that are hard to do manually. You can just get the 3D printer to print them off super easy. But some other things I'm still a little skeptical on for 3D printing. For example, Relativity, when they 3D print their entire body of the rocket. When Relativity 3D prints their body of their rocket, what they're doing is melting this tiny thin strand of metal. I believe it might be aluminum, but don't quote me on that, at specific points, and letting it drip and dry quickly, and doing this over and over again. So I don't know if the most efficient way of building this structure is to spend hours and hours melting this tiny strand of metal. Like, I understand it makes a lot of sense for a lot of other parts. I'm just not too sure about this part, if it's the most efficient way and necessarily cheaper. I do know it takes quite a long time, and they have these artifacts in the rocket, these bumps that are a result of how the 3D printing process works. Adds a little bit of mass to the rocket. They say it's not a huge deal, but I think any mass added to a rocket is important, because that's mass that you can't send into orbit. Now, there are some other benefits to 3D printing, though, so I'm not saying it's not without its merits. One thing that they can do is very quickly iterate and change their design. So if they're printing a part or component of their rocket, they can just change the code of how they want it printed out, and boom, you're printing out a redesigned version of your rocket. Whereas some of these more traditional manufacturing techniques that Rocket Lab does use, as well as SpaceX and others, once you have your design going and you're production lines going. It's very much more difficult to make changes to the design of your rocket because you need new moldings, you need all new sorts of processes to build out those rockets. So changing the design after it's been implemented is more difficult when you're not 3D printing it. That is something in their favor. But to say that it's so much cheaper than what everyone else in the industry is doing to date, I don't agree with that personally myself, although I don't claim to be an absolute expert on everything 3D printing. Now, I just wanted to share a few charts as well, comparing Rocket Lab to SpaceX and how they've executed over the initial years of the companies. Chamath talks a lot about SpaceX being the only game in town, and to be fair, he's kind of right. Companies in the heavy lift space, like the Falcon 9, Falcon Heavy, or even medium lift technically, although Falcon 9 is really on the edge between medium and heavy. But let's look at the launch outcomes for these companies and kind of see how they progressed over the years, because I think Rocket Lab's actually doing really well in this regard, and it's something that he overlooked and a lot of people overlooked. So we look at the early history of SpaceX. Back in 2010, they had about one or two successful launches, I believe. It's hard to zoom in on the chart. None in 2011, a few more in 2012, and we're really at 2016, they're hitting a rate of about 8 per year. It really picks up from there as you get a kind of S-curve growth going. Really starts to pick up into 2022. But if we look at those same years for Rocket Lab, we can see they're actually doing very well. So these are the first 7 years of the company. Rocket Lab has a launch, they hit 3, then they hit 6, then we hit 7. I mean, we have a bit of a failure issue here, so we did have some slowdowns. But 2022, they hit 9 launches, which is more than SpaceX had in their 7th year, and this is the 6th year of Rocket Lab. For Rocket Lab's 7th year, they're now projecting about 13, 14 launches, which is obviously well in excess of SpaceX's 8th in their 7th year. So in terms of scaling up, mastering launch, turning it into a reliable service they can provide, Rocket Lab is doing just as well as SpaceX did, if not better, in the early stages of the company. And you can argue that launching a heavier vehicle brings more value, and you shouldn't compare one-to-one for a heavy vehicle versus a light vehicle. But I still think this shows Rocket Lab's progressing quite well with their Electron rocket and doing just as well as SpaceX did in scaling that up. Now, Relativity is a company that has not launched as of yet successfully, and despite that has a massive valuation in comparison to Rocket Lab. So I think giving them this massive head start and saying they're so much better than a company that's been launching successfully for years when they've never even launched successfully is a little bit scary if I were an investor in that company. I know we've seen other companies try to launch. It's really hard. There's been lots of failures, well-documented ones I'm sure you know about. So I'm just going to pop up a few companies here that have recently gone out of business, had to declare bankruptcy in the space sector. It's extremely difficult to get space right. We all know space is extremely hard. So I wouldn't take anything for granted that Relativity is just going to be a smashing success and they're not going to encounter any hiccups along the way. Frankly, every company blows up a few rockets. So they're going to have to go through those growing pains, deal with those issues that will inevitably arise, those issues that Rocket Lab has already gone through and had those learnings. So definitely a lot of companies that have gone out of business. There is a non-trivial chance that Relativity will encounter problems of their own with their extremely ambitious new Terran R rocket that they're working in the future. And I really think that Rocket Lab deserves a valuation equal to, or to be honest, much greater than Relativity at this point in time, despite some of the interesting promise Relativity may show. In terms of the valuations between these two companies, Relativity Space had a valuation of $4.2 billion, and that was back in 2021 even. Rocket Lab has a valuation of $2 billion, so just less than half of that. Now, it's hard to say what Relativity's value is today because they only really have valuations when they issue new shares. It's not on the public market fluctuating every day like Rocket Lab has, but I think this valuation is far too rich for me for a company that has not launched. Rocket Lab is launching consistently and successfully. They have a new medium vehicle coming online. I will give Relativity some kudos for their Terran R rocket. It's extremely ambitious. They're shooting for complete reusability, which is something not even Rocket Lab is doing. We will be losing the second stage of the Neutron rocket. I think that might have a lot to do with the size of the rockets. Neutron is going to be a little bit smaller than the Terran R. But I would say there is a tremendous amount more execution risk with Relativity than there is with the Rocket Lab. So just to dismiss them like that, say they're incapable, I think is completely unfair of Chamath. And if you're really someone who's investing in the industry, I think you should know a little better than that, personally anyway. So what do you think? If you had the option to invest in Relativity, would you rather buy Relativity or Rocket Lab if they were both valued the exact same? One of them has a lot of interesting potential future technologies, could be a lot of hype. They've never launched successfully before. Rocket Lab, I think, is still quite exciting. They've got a lot of new upcoming technologies as well, but they have been launching consistently for many years. They have a great track record. And let's not forget about the space systems side of the business and the future space applications business, which is extremely huge for them, bringing in a lot of revenue with things like solar panels, entire satellites, reaction wheels, star trackers, flight software, and in the future, managing satellites for customers. So there's a lot to be excited about in the future of Rocket Lab. And yeah, I just wanted to ask, who do you think you would invest in given the choice? I'll see you guys in the next one. Thanks for watching. I hope you have a great week.